Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the one country that is not on the AP exam. That is the United States of America. The flag of the United States has 50 stars, which represent the 50 states, and 13 stripes, which represent the 13 colonies. Blue represents justice. White represents innocence and purity. Red represents strength and courage and sacrifice. The overall population demographics of the United States, it's the most multiracial country in the AP6 plus the United States. 60% white, 19% Hispanic, 13% black. East Asian, which includes Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, and especially India, is the quickest growing population in the United States. And then the number of people that have identified as two races or mixed race has had its largest increase in US history between 2010 and 2020. The United States, this is called a population pyramid. It shows the age and gender demographics of the country. The thicker the area, the more of that population. So if you'll notice here, the bottom is in 2000, the bottom is bigger than the top. That's because we have more younger people than older people. Now that we're in 2020, if you've noticed, the top becomes bigger, which means we are actually an older country generationally. When you get to countries like Nigeria, which you'll notice this top is much thinner and it's much bigger here at the bottom. And that's because people die sooner in underdeveloped countries. In a place like the United States, the UK, you're going to see also top heavy um, population pyramids. Now, this is kind of important that it doesn't become too top heavy because these people down here are the taxpayers. They're the ones that actually do the work and pay taxes to keep these people up top alive. And that can influence policy going forward. So let's start with the history of the United States. A lot of US history starts from two colonies, and who we are culturally comes a lot from these two colonies. The first colony is the Massachusetts Bay colonies. These come from parts of England and very religiously bound, seeking religious freedom. The colonies in Massachusetts Bay were very puritanical, meaning that the religion had them work really hard so they can get to heaven. So a lot of the U.S. work ethic comes from Massachusetts Bay puritanical values. They were also comparatively pretty egalitarian and big into education and debate. So if you remember, like the Mayflower Compact is passed when they get to Plymouth Rock. They hold a lot of town councils and town halls. It's really fundamentally a sort of democratic system, and of course, what Massachusetts Bay is really into is the idea of a utopian society, actually working towards the benefit of overall society better. Remember, these are very well educated people that come to Massachusetts Bay. A lot of the first colleges start in this region. So that's where a lot of this utopian idealism of the U.S., like things can be always better and optimistic, it comes from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Chesapeake Colony is different. Chesapeake Colony is a traditional, monetarily driven manor aristocratic system. So money is the main driver. Remember, people were coming to Jamestown seeking gold, essentially. Very paternalistic and class based. There was the upper class, and the upper class civilized the lower classes on down. It was almost impossible to break up into higher classes going up. This is where you get a lot of indentured servitude and, of course, eventually slavery. And remember that these colonies start out as property of the United Kingdom. So the United States colonies were actually colonized by Great Britain and then, of course, broke off in the um, American War for Independence. It starts with these 13 colonies right here. The United States is known as the Great Democratic Experiment. And it started before the American War of Independence when the British kind of left the United States colonies alone. They developed their own sense of things like a little bit of free speech, freedom of the press. There was more liberal ideas around religion in some of the colonies. And so they came together, and of course, to fight eventually against the British in the American Revolution. Now, you might say, well, this is a democratic experiment. Then why is there slavery uh, that's been embedded in US history? That's a very good question. Let's remember that slavery is not exclusive to the United States by any stretch. In fact, it's not exclusive to European powers. It was prevalent all around the world, including in Africa, which is how part of how slaves were transferred to places like Brazil and eventually the US colonies. But the reason why slavery is actually um, embedded in the US culture is because it was either going to be the United States was going to be able to form a country, or it wasn't, and it was going to remain oppressed by the British colonies. A lot of this unification had to be very delicate because the South wanted to keep the slaves and slavery active, and if not, they would threaten to break away and not form the United States. They would remain properties of the British. That's why in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, and this is the document that actually creates the United States, in the first draft, it actually says that slavery is wrong and slavery is bad. But then it is removed because a lot of the Southern delegates from the Southern colonies said, "Look, we're not going to be a part of this if you bag on slaves." And everybody knew that eventually slavery was going to have to be dealt with. But did you want a country or not? Now, this document, the Declaration of Independence, which creates the United States of America, is super important, though, because it has the phrase, all men are created equal, and that you are born with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So every time an oppressed or marginalized population comes forward, they point to this document and say, look, in your founding document, you'll literally say, all men are created equal. Therefore, there's no reason why we can't be equal. It has to be that it's literally the founding principle within your founding document. And so, has the United States become more or less free? Well, if you look at suffrage, which is the right to vote over time, you'll see qualifications eliminated over time. Religious qualifications eliminated in 1810. Property requirements were eliminated in 1840s. You have the 15th Amendment, which gets rid of the race requirement. Gender requirements in the 1920s. The Snyder Act allows indigenous people to vote. Residents of DC get an electoral vote in 1961. Poll taxes and literacy tests are eliminated. And finally, everyone over the age of 18 with the 26th Amendment in 1971. So we are becoming a freer state. The democratic experiment is, in fact, working. Now, the first government of the United States was under Constitution version 1, which is called the Articles of Confederation. And in a Confederate government, you have these regional authorities, which are going to be like geographically, they would be like states. They would actually have greater power than the central authority, which would be the US government. So, under the Articles of Confederation, the first constitution, these regions had way too much power, and the US government basically had very little. And so, nothing ever got done, and it created an enormously unstable government system. So, it was toasted for this document, the current United States Constitution passed in 1789. The Constitution of the United States establishes how the government of the United States is actually ran. It is probably one of the greatest documents in existence because of what it does. And now, what it did is something that no other government document ever did in the history of the world. Number one, it actually says the government is held accountable to the people, and that the people are actually the deciders ultimately of that government. So, we, the people of the United States, is in the preamble. It's the first thing in the Constitution, and that eventually the government is accountable to the will of the people. It was the first time a democracy was literally stated within its founding document. The number two, the United States created the idea of the presidential system of government. That is where the voters actually vote not only for one, but two parts of government: the legislative branch, in this case, members of Congress, and the executive branch, the president of the United States. Now, then these two will select the judicial branch, which in the United States is the Supreme Court. What does this do? Well, again, you're held accountable to the voters, but it actually also separates the power of government into three different branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. It is the theory that the Baron de Montesquieu starts a long time ago, now comes into practice here in the United States, and is, by the way, also copied by Nigeria and Mexico. So, number two, creates a presidential system of government that allows for separation of powers. Number three, it makes the judicial branch independent. The judicial branch is not held accountable to any kind of executive king, president, or lord. The judicial branch actually interprets the founding document of the United States, the Constitution, and its government structure. So that means that this branch here is super independent. They can actually overrule the executive and overrule the legislative and overrule the voters because they follow the Constitution of the United States, not any specific group of people. Number four is the establishment of a federal government instead of a confederate government where these states and regions have greater power. In a federal government, the central power and the regional powers share power. Okay. So the US government, there are things the US governments can do, and there are things that the state governments can do. There's also things that the state governments can't do, but there's also things the central government can't do. So there's a shared sense of power. Local areas feel more invested in their democracy with that power. Finally, number 5, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution are known as the Bill of Rights. They are fundamentally awesome, and they are, at this point in history, no one had ever created a document that literally protects the citizens of the country from the government. You are born with certain unalienable rights. Those rights are listed in the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments, exists to protect the citizens from an abusive government. Free speech does not exist to protect you from another citizen. Free speech exists to protect you from the government oppressing your speech. Now, these 5 things are super important because they are essentially the pillars of every democratic government. The idea that the government is held accountable by the people, the idea that you have separation of powers, the idea that you have an independent judiciary that's accountable to the law, not a person, the idea that you have power that is shared with regions and a central government, and the idea that you have civil liberties that are guaranteed to be protected from the government. Whenever we look at democratic countries and we check and see how democratic a country is, this stuff up here really is the things that are the foundations, the pillars of the democratic system, and they existed here in the United States, and they started here in the United States, the great democratic experiment.